Hey y'all, welcome to another episode of When Love Comes, the podcast. I'm your host, April Nowlin. I am a certified relationship coach, and my passion is helping people to heal from heartbreak, to create a life that they love, and to prepare for the love that they deserve. So I started this podcast a little over a year ago, and we are in season 3. But I started it because I wanted to share the things that I learned after my third divorce. So if this is your first time listening, you may be like, what, April? Yes, 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 y'all. And there were things that I learned in that healing journey that I want to share with all of you guys so that you don't make the same mistakes that I do. If you are a regular listener, welcome back. I am glad to have you on this journey with us. And so my guests today are a couple that I met just recently, and I absolutely love not just the work that they're doing through their podcast, but I love just their story. So Tony and Dr. Lisa Gowdy, they are the host of Say Yes Again podcast, and they really encourage you guys through healing and through believing again for love. Because let me tell y'all something, when you've been through heartbreak, you may find yourself in that space of like, I ain't never doing this again. I've been there, y'all. And so they're really helping you guys to just believe in love again, even if your heart has been broken. So I want to welcome you guys to the show, Dr. Lisa and Tony.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having us.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you for being here. So I want to start with a question that I never put on the list, but I always ask, and I'll have Dr. Lisa answer it first. What was your examples of relationships growing up?
That's a great question. I think my examples of relationships varied, right? So there were single women in my family who raised children and provided a stable home. And then there were also family members who were married for many, many, many years. The most positive example that I can recall in my family is my uncle and aunt, who actually were my second. I would call them second because they were my mother's aunt and uncle. And they were married for, probably 50 years or so, before each of them actually passed. And they served as the home that everybody showed up in. They had all the celebrations at their home. They embraced everyone in the family. And I think they probably just gave us all a good example of what a positive relationship looks
like. Awesome. So do you feel like as you matured into adulthood, that was the example that you set for yourself, the type of relationship that you wanted?
It was, they married obviously, at a young age. I didn't get married, my first marriage, until I was 27, but they married at a young age. They raised 2 children. My aunt, she stayed home most of the time. That wasn't in my forecast. I knew I wanted to have a career, but yeah, they provided, again, just that stable home environment. They loved one another, and they also argued. So I saw what a healthy argument looked like. Again, they raised 2 children, and they were really just really passionate about just family coming together. So they definitely set that first example, and they were the first people in our family to own a home as well. So yeah.
Nice. All right, how about you, Tony? What were your examples growing up?
Well, my examples were quite different from Lisa. I really didn't see that whole element of marriage as closely as Lisa did. When I think about it, I think about my step grandparents who would pick my brother and I up on Sundays and take us over to their house. And, we had to go to church, so on and so forth. They were married for at least 30 plus years. So it was a sense of peace. It was a sense of consistency as well as teamwork, embraced in tons of love. So they really gave me a good idea of what that looks like, what that felt like. So they were kind of my role models.
Okay. And so do you feel like that shaped your expectations for relationships as you got older?
Yes, because when I was younger, I loved being in that atmosphere. I loved having dinner together, praying together, etc. So I used to think as a young man, when I grew older, this is what I'd like to have happen for me. Although I never told anybody, this is kind of the first time I'm even talking about it. But that was kind of my mental foundation, if you will. I wanted to kind of not mimic, but kind of follow in their footsteps. So here I
Yeah.
am.
Yeah, I love it. I love it. I start with that question because what I've learned through personal experience, through studies, is that so much of what we see as children shapes what we expect our relationships to be like when we get older. So if we see, that loving home, we kind of recreate that. If we see a home that's maybe a little more dysfunctional when it comes to relationships, we try to stay away from that. And so I always like to start with that because our beginnings play so much into who we choose to be in relationships with, what our expectations are. And sometimes we have to make a shift, right? From what we thought we wanted or what we thought relationships were to what they actually were. So, diving into that, Lisa, I want you to share with us what was your journey of relationships before Tony?
Wow. So before meeting Tony, I was in a long-term marriage. So I was married for 25 years. I got married, right after I graduated from medical school or shortly thereafter. We met in college. So I really didn't date a lot, prior to that. I was a study wart because I was, on my way to becoming a physician. So I spent a lot of time in the library and in the books and didn't do a lot of dating. So, that was my first sort of real, I guess, relationship. So I got married at the age of 27, had
Mm.
two children shortly thereafter that. Prior to meeting Tony, I was in a long term marriage for 25 years. So, and there were good times in that. We definitely, had some good times in the beginning. And I think sometimes, maybe other people out there could relate that sometimes after being in a marriage for a long time, things change. You change, the person changes, your career path changes, your goals change, or sometimes even your values change. And I think
Yes.
that's sort of where we saw ourselves or felt like that was leading, towards the end.
Yeah, I think that there's a shift that happens in all of us as we age, as we grow. And sometimes the partner that we're with, we are, whether it's growing in different directions, like you said, values have changed. So when did you realize in that marriage that this was no longer the best place for you?
I would probably have to say it probably was about, I don't know, maybe 5 or so years prior to that, prior to it actually, ending, or maybe even a little longer than that. I can't really pinpoint a specific time, but you kind of get the feeling,
Mhm.
like women's intuition. I think if you really tap into your feelings, you kind of know something's different, something's changing. And I think a lot of times for long-term marriages as well, the dynamic usually shifts when children get older, when they move out of the home, and
Yeah.
you go through that sort of, midlife experience together, the empty nester syndrome. So you really have to take a hard look at your relationship once the kids are out of the house as to what have we really built here? What is it that we can still work with, moving forward? So I think that was probably a time where things started to shift as well, when the kids were gone, because the focus was no longer on them or the family as a unit per se, as much as it was on
Mm.
the two of us and being in that relationship.
Yeah, what you're talking about is so common. And when I was younger, I had an aunt and uncle that got divorced. I want to say after like 25 or 30 years. And it was the weirdest thing, right? Because I'm like, y'all been together all this time, just
Yeah.
stick it out. But that was me at like, like 16, right? But what you're explaining is very common in that empty nester stage, especially if the marriage was centered on the children, when that became your primary focus throughout that marriage, when it became kind of all about the kids. And not to say that this was your case, but it's very common, right? Um, and then also, you think about you get into a relationship and your identity starts to change, right? You're now mom, you're now wife, you're now doctor, you're all these different, you wear all these different hats. And I think sometimes when we get to that empty nester stage, it's almost like, well, who's Dr. Lisa now? Who is
Yeah.
Lisa, right? Or who is your partner, and trying to navigate those waters. So I want to talk about still, Dr. Lisa, what did life look like right out of divorce? Because you've been married 25 years, most of your life, right? A great deal of your life. What did that look like for you?
Yeah, initially it was very scary, because again, used to being in a relationship, used to having someone there, right? So now became a time where I was alone by myself. Again, like you mentioned, I had to figure out who Lisa was and who was I outside of this relationship. Although I did have my career and all those other things, I still had to really sit with that. So it was very scary initially. And I think that, over time, you sort of get to, well, you're actually forced to look at yourself,
Yeah.
you're forced to look at yourself in the mirror and say, okay, here I am. What am I going to do now? What's my next step? How can I push past this? Not really push past it, but how can I survive this, and move on to my next.
Yeah, yeah, that's a very common kind of place to be in, right? Who am I? And I'm glad you said something right just now. You said, not how can I push like kind of past it, but it's almost like we need to go through it. And I think that's what when you find someone like the situation I was in, where I was in this cycle of unhealthy relationships. After each divorce, I didn't heal. I kind of pushed past the pain, right? Instead of pushing through it and finding healing. And then I think you said something also that's very valuable that I just preach about is that journey of self discovery, right? It's rediscovering who you are and not even who the person you were. Because sometimes what happens, what keeps us stuck is we want to go back to the person I was before. And it's like that was 25 years ago. I'm don't even look like that person, right?
Right.
So what are some of the things that you did along that journey of self-discovery?
Yeah, so I think that one was I've always had a strong foundation in the church, and I think that that was one of the things that I really tapped into. So I've kind of elevated, if you will say, my spiritual practice of just praying every day. I found a church here in the community where, I was settling in and started attending church services. So definitely elevating my spiritual practice was really important and infusing in that, some meditation. I started meditating, which I share with Tony now as well. So we kind of do it
Yes, yes.
together, but meditating. And then it was really, I think, about making sure that I stayed close to a sense of community. So, my family was really, it was a godsend actually that I had moved here in this town where I moved because my brother lived here and my dad lived here, having them really, really close. And then my other brother moved here as well. So having everyone really close by was also very, very helpful in that healing journey. And they knew obviously what I was going through and was helping to support me through that. So yeah, the spiritual practice, I would say the community, and then actually getting some help, like getting counseling as
Yeah.
well. That's the third thing because, I'm not too ashamed to say that, I think that we can all benefit from that. So I had to really sit with someone who could help me process all of that because that
Yeah.
that was a long time and a lot to unpack.
Yeah, yeah, and I'm glad that you did not do it alone. In so many cases, we will fall into this place of isolation, right? Whether it's and particularly in faith-based communities, whether it is through, feeling shameful about the divorce, feeling unlovable, whatever those things are that we're feeling and pushing ourselves into isolation instead of pushing ourselves into community and
Mhm.
reaching out and saying, hey, I need help. One of the reasons I do the work that I do was through my healing journey. When I say my healing journey, if you're just listening, this is after the third divorce. Clearly, I didn't heal after the first two. But along that healing journey, it was the first time that I went to therapy for real. And it was the first time that I had a life coach and a person who said, what do you want for your future? Because no one had ever asked me that before. And it was great to have that community of whether it was spiritual advisors like my pastor or my sister, my mom, right? Different people I could go to. But she was the first person that was like, what do you want your life to look like? And this was outside of relationships, but just what do you want April's life to look like? And that is why I advocate for having kind of that circle of care. So not just that one person, right? Like we can't just go to our best friend. We can't just go to our mom. Like, and sometimes we got to pay for some help. Sometimes we got to pay for therapy or counseling or coaching and spend some money to get the help that we need. So I'm so glad that you invested in yourself in that season. All right, Tony, you're up. So you're up. So share with us what your relationship journey looked like before.
Well, I got married later in life. I got married in 2012, you know, and after that, was it 2000, maybe 2015? Although we were together for about 7 years, we ended up getting a divorce in 2015. Again, I chose to get married later in life. No, I guess maybe a year before we got divorced, we started realizing that, the commonality or whatever our expectations were with reference to marriage was drastically different. Like Lisa and I like to say, we always look at our past relationships or marriage as positive. We try not to dwell on the negative, but it was kind of, obvious that we had gotten to a point where we were going different ways. 2015, I was divorced, and, kind of just, isolated myself to a certain extent and then gradually became a part of a wonderful community. Like Lisa mentioned, we happened to go to the same church. We didn't know at that time. I really delve into my spiritual relationship as well. And also, kind of not to mimic what she's saying, clinical and professional help. I really infused myself as a man. We typically want to feel like we have it all together, all the answers. We can do it all by ourselves. That whole Tarzan syndrome, at a point like that, I realized that I needed to step outside of that. I needed to speak with somebody professionally to get back to this particular space.
Yeah, yeah. So for you, why did you get married later in life?
I guess I don't want to speak for all men out there, but like most men, you feel like you're missing something, you know? You're just hanging out, cruising and grooving or whatever, whatever you'd like to say. That was kind of my reason, just I don't know. And then to some degree, you mentioned earlier, where did your definition, your impression of marriage/relationship begin? Well, not to discredit my parents who've done a wonderful job in raising or rearing me, but I come from a fractured standpoint, So that whole standpoint for the majority of that situation was kind of fractured, kind of tainted to a certain degree. So really, although I saw my step grandparents on Sundays, so I saw them rather infrequently, for the majority of the time I was around a cesspool of people who were single, you know? I think that had some impact on me as well.
Yeah. Yeah, I like to ask that question, and I'm glad you answered it with, just kind of that space of being in of like, well, this is just what's supposed to happen next, right? Or what needs to happen. Because I always ask couples when I'm coaching them or people who are, going through a divorce is, how did your relationship start? Like, how did you choose that person? Because I'll tell you, so many times, how we start a relationship will just play into how that relationship goes, right? And I talk
Mm,
about things like choosing relationships because we're filling a void or we're almost feeling like it's the next thing we're supposed to do versus this is really the person for me, and I'm really committed to, this relationship. So
exactly.
coming out of that relationship, what were your thoughts on future relationships? Did you say, yes, I want to do this again? Or were you in a space of like, I'm good?
I think I was pretty much in a space of denial / I'm good. I was on the heels of being drastically bruised from my perspective, the whole I'm gonna, be dancing with the stigma of being divorced. How do I explain this to people? So I really was going through a lot of things as far as the emotional standpoint, my identity, the whole identity crisis, my familiarity with reference to that friendly circle that I was a part of being married. That whole schematic changes drastically. So it was kind of like, fright, if you will. So I really didn't have any immediate aspirations in terms of getting married or getting into a relationship again. That was the last thing on my mind, you know? It really was. So yeah, that was kind of the last thing.
Yeah, yeah. How about you, Dr. Lisa? After your divorce, how did you feel about a future relationship?
Yeah, so I think the same. I really did not even think about, getting married again. I kind of felt like, okay, that was a long time. and
It
and
was.
you know, maybe this is just my time to kind of just be alone. And so I felt like that for a while until, some friends encouraged me just to sort of get out and start dating again. And so I eventually did. And then my whole position sort of changed to, well, maybe I'll just find a life partner.
We start inching our way back into it,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, yeah. He cracks up every time I talk about it
Life
because that was
partner.
a whole thing once we started dating that,
Yeah.
we got to talking about. Yeah, so that's kind of where I was for a long time. It was just like, maybe I'll just, find a life partner. I liked
Mhm.
being in relationship, and having that special someone, but getting
Yeah.
married was certainly not at the top of my list.
Yeah, yeah. We start bargaining, I think, with ourselves, right? As the seasons go on. Um, Anytime that I meet someone though who has the approach of, I can't trust. Like, so neither one of you guys said that, which was great. But I'll meet people who will say, or I'll coach people who will say, like, I can't trust men or I can't trust women. Um,
Mm,
and where I feel like that comes from, one, it is a place of being unhealed, but it is not necessarily a lack of trust in the opposite sex. It is a lack of trust in ourselves to choose better.
yeah.
And right, like we feel like I've chosen this same thing so many times that instead of saying like I just don't know how to choose well, I just don't trust the other side. And so I'm glad neither one of you guys said that. But I do want to talk about now your journey. So tell me, how did you guys meet?
Yeah. So you want me to start?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay.
The
So
woman typically tells the story with more detail. So it's so funny how the woman always, you want me to tell it?
he actually remembers a lot more than I do. But sure, but I'll start. Yeah, so like I mentioned, my friends had encouraged me to sort of get back out there and start dating again. And then I realized like after 25 years, like I don't even know how to date. Like, I've been with the same person for so long and like who's
Yeah.
that I date? What does that even look like at 50, right? So yeah, so I reached out and actually had a dating coach because I needed to know how to just navigate conversations again, like, feel confident in sort of what I was saying and, how to approach dating. So I started, just getting out there and then eventually I did online dating. So I was on, the dating sites and that's how I met Tony. We met on match.com.
Yes.
And, it was funny because before we met, I had been through, just sort of dating before and was like, oh, if this is all that's there, like I'm done. I'm really done. And lo and behold, I had a break for a while, then got back on, and then here Tony pops up into my, my line where where I can swipe or whatever. And
Feed.
in my feed, right, right, right. And then I don't remember who liked who first, but we started, just conversating. And it took a little while, before we sort of, I guess, sort of had some consistency, right,
Yeah.
with our reaching out to each other and talking and all those things. So,
I had to
yeah.
track her
Yeah.
down.
So you can pick up. Go ahead. I'll let you finish that part.
Yeah, like she mentioned, I don't remember who liked who, but I remember getting that actual chime or, indication of interest. And, after a while, you're just kind of like, okay, who is this? Because it's a process. It takes a while. It
Yes.
doesn't happen instantaneously. And so when I clicked on it, I saw this beautiful fluorescent Lisa. And so that was very intriguing. I went on to read her profile. I'm into that sentence structure, so on and so forth. Everything was in line. And I'm like, wow, okay. So, to fast forward, we eventually start texting and, speaking on the phone. And it was just a warm conversation. No phoniness, no representatives or anything. I could tell she was speaking just from her heart, you know. It was kind of intermittent as far as the communication is concerned. And I kind of, pulled back a little bit because I couldn't figure out why is this lady so busy, right? Yeah, maybe for about what, 2 months. 2 months.
Oh.
And then it just dawned on me, as I started just, cleansing myself so that I could be receptive to the energies out there in the universe, for lack of a better term. I'm driving down the street and Heavenly Father just said, call Lisa. Now, she's not going to answer. And I did. I called her.
I was not avoiding him.
And she did not answer. She did not answer. But anyway, we eventually, start re-engaging again. And that's when I just said, hey, listen, I find the conversation to be very intriguing. I'd like to take you out on my dime, wherever you'd like to go. And if you like the conversation, we can continue from there. Sometimes you have to just get right to it.
Yes, yes. So I got questions because I'm loving this. So I want to ask you guys, because with my clients, and I wouldn't consider myself a dating coach, but I have a dating component to my coaching. So I do have clients who are preparing to date again. And Dr. Lisa, I'm so glad you said that, because no one taught us how to date, right? My dating advice was don't get pregnant. And I was like, okay, all right, well, great. And so one of the things that I have become passionate about is helping people to date well, right? And to prepare for that healthy relationship. So I'm so glad you invested in that. And look, y'all, it paid off.
It paid off,
Yes.
right?
It paid off. So what made you guys choose online dating? Because that's a big question that I get a lot versus, dating, meeting someone in person. And I do believe you can meet a great person anywhere. But what made you guys choose that?
That's a good question, because for me, I was a little hesitant just because of, obviously, security reasons, safety, my profession, like all those things, right?
Yes.
I didn't
Yeah.
kind of want to put myself out there like that. But then,
Mhm.
through my coaching, I was, obviously advise how to do that, and still
Mhm.
be discreet, about certain things.
Yeah.
So that was helpful. And I think I probably chose online dating because I'm not the person really to kind of get out there, as I consider myself an introvert to some degree.
Yes.
So I'm not out, in the clubs, for lack of a better word, or just kind of out there meeting people in that arena. Most of my exposure of being out is in a business, sort of format,
Right.
professional basis, exactly, not more of a social basis. So it just provided a way for me to kind of get to know some, people, and be able to see who was out there, through a platform where I could do it, at any time in the privacy of my home, and, and just kind of explore what that dating would look like.
And then how about you, Tony?
Well, as I was going through my process, my healing process, and I was on the tail end of that, one of my buddies noticed that, my life was just kind of like extremely isolated. And he knew me beforehand. He suggested, he said, Tony, let me tell you about this dating app. Immediately, I shut it down. That's for losers. Who goes on there? Those people aren't serious. I was just being utterly pessimistic about it, again, because of what I had just gone through. But eventually he persuaded me and I participated, so on and so forth. And like Lisa and I say, you have to establish your boundaries when you go into that type of situation, of which I did. The rest is history. It took a little while, but eventually, I met Lisa. So that's kind of how I was referred by a good friend. Good
Yeah,
friend.
yeah.
Yeah.
It sounds like you guys both had good support in your life.
Yes.
It sounds like they encouraged you when you were ready. And that's what good support does, right? It sees, like Tony, I hear you say things like as I was at the end of my healing journey, right? You had gone through that season of healing and not just kind of jumping back out there, into the next relationship. And then, Tony, I just want to give you a shout out. I preach this. Ladies, if y'all are listening, let me tell you something. If a man is interested in you, he's going to pursue you. He going to call, even knowing she might be too busy to answer, right? He's going to be like, look, let's go out. on my dime, but I get that, where people will be like, well, I don't know if he really likes me. I don't know. Listen, if a man likes you, he is going to let it be known. Am I right, Tony?
You are 100% correct. In fact, when we had that conversation and I suggested that we get together, she said, when? I said, tomorrow. So soon? Yes.
Yeah. I was like, okay, well, he's serious.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. And I tell you, men are intentional. They are intentional. So
Very
now I
much
want to
so.
talk about, so you guys have now connected. You've gone out on Tony's dime. You had a good time. As you start this dating process, did either of you, have anything that maybe came up from the past that you were just like, I didn't know I was going to feel this way, or any challenges that you guys had in that dating season?
Any challenges? Trying to think. I think the only thing is that it's really well, one thing I will say, so, and I think we talked about this. So my love language really is like spending quality time. That's one of my love languages, right? And I think that I knew that that's what I was looking for in a relationship because it wasn't as important in my previous relationship. So one of the challenges for me was finding someone who also felt like that was important, or at least sort of supported me in that, right? So yeah, so as we were dating, I kind of in the beginning felt like, is this gonna work? Because that's sort of my love language, and I don't know if that's gonna be part of how we connect or whatever. And actually, it is like, so he loves just spending quality time, yeah,
Yes.
and will
Yes.
tell me when I'm not, even though it's my
Yes.
love language. But anyway,
Keep her informed. Keep her informed.
Yes, yes, we have to be supportive in our relationships, and I'm glad that Tony, you are aware enough, right, of Dr. Lisa, where you're like, all right, we're missing this space here. Let's get back to it. Let's get back to it. And I think that's important, that each person, each partner takes ownership in a relationship when it comes to the happiness of the other person. Now, let me be clear when I say this. It is not your job to make that person happy.
Okay.
However, I think a great partnership is adding to that happiness, and at those times reminding that person or steering that person back to the things that gives them joy. So
Yes.
you guys are dating at this point later in life, right? And there's more and more people. I read a study just recently that like the largest group of singles right now are people in their 60s. Like 39% of the single population is in their 60s. So dating later in life. How was this different? And I know, Dr. Lisa, you said you didn't date as much, in your younger years, but was there differences that you guys saw in this season that you hadn't seen in previous dating season, like when you were younger?
From my perspective, obviously going through the 20s, 30s, 40s, so on and so forth, my perspective on love, infatuation, relationships is totally different. It was totally different then as it is now, right? So what was obviously important to me then does not mimic what's important to me now. I like the stability factor. I love conversations. I love someone who can intrigue me and add to my overall experience. I like somebody who just naturally causes me to grow. Lisa does all that. She checks all the boxes. And I'm not just, tooting her horn. Whenever we would converse, the conversation, whether it was political, whether it was just traditional conversation, whether it was family oriented, she was able to deal with all those particular facets in a conversation and some. But the thing that was just so gorgeous about that whole episode is that she didn't wear that on her sleeves, right? Because quite frankly, I was communicating with some other persons. That's what that whole platform is about. But once I became indoctrinated into her whole essence and I saw what was going on, because I could just feel it, the intrinsic beauty, right? The intrinsic beauty, the external beauty, that's important and that's critical too, but the intrinsic beauty. And so I said, hey, wait a minute. You see her smiling, right? You got to keep them smiling.
I love it. I love it. Yeah.
yeah, and
If
I
you
think
guys, If you guys are listening to this and not watching the video, please go watch the video because these two have had the biggest smiles on their faces. And when I say I'm here for it all, but if y'all haven't seen the video, go watch the video because you got to see them together. So, Dr. Lisa, for you, you're dating a little bit later in life, right? What are
Yeah.
some of the things you're thinking in this season?
Yeah, I think that although I didn't date a lot early on, I think in my head I had an idea of, that person who you wanted to be in relationship with had to sort of add to your upward growth, right? And for lack of a better word. So whether that looked like, what their professional status was, or sort of, what their economic status looked like, all those things I think earlier on for me were important, and more important then than it was or is now, right?
Mhm.
So for me, it was more about the person, like Tony mentioned, who the person was on the inside. What were their values? Did we share the same values? Was that person respectful? Did they really care about me? Do they want to grow? Do they like to travel? All the things that I like to do. And how are they going to really add to the relationship? And not so much about what they did or their title, or anything like that. That was no longer important. Now they still had to be able to support themselves. I'm not saying that.
That part.
Not saying that. But that whole title and who they are and identity in that realm was not as important today as it probably was initially.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I find that as we get older, and at the time of this recording, I'm 48, almost 49, we tend to look more, or we should be, let me say that, we
Right.
should be looking more, right, towards things like character, quality of life, right,
Mhm.
versus just what's your title, what's your job. And I think those needs just change, right? When we get married, when we're younger, right, most of the time we get married, probably don't have a lot. We're thinking about building a family, things like that. On the back end now, we're thinking about what's your retirement plan,
Right.
things like that. So I want to take just a small step back and ask you guys, because what you're describing, you're both being very articulate about what you were looking for. Did you, going into this dating process, have a list or something like that that you used to kind of, I won't say judge, but use to choose the next person?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I mean, personally, I had my non-negotiables, is what we like to classify or coin them as. My prerequisites that I was looking for in a woman. Obviously, attractive on the inside and the outside, down to earth, articulate, just financially stable, just no games, no nonsense. Those were a few of my well-rounded, classy, culturally oriented. I was looking for all of those things. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think I did have probably some as well, some non-negotiables. And I think, stop it.
Problem.
So anyway, yeah, so I didn't really, I think when you talked about early on, a lot of times when we in our 20s, we're like, oh, it had to be tall, dark, and handsome, 6'2", and abs and all of that. Okay, so we're not doing that anymore, right? I mean, it's nice to have, that's a nice to have, right? But we're looking at the internal more so. So for me, it was like, I wanted that person to be able to be vulnerable. Can we talk about things? Can we go deep into, our emotions? Can we understand each other on that level? Spending quality time, which I mentioned, was also really
Yes.
important. Being spiritually grounded, was important to me as well. Financial stability, definitely, was another one. So yeah, so there were about 4 or 5 things that were really important to me that I was looking for, in my partner or potential person that was going to be in a relationship with.
Yeah, I'm glad to hear that because so many times I think people don't take the time to really find out what am I looking for, right? It's kind of especially when you're on like the dating apps, because initially it's the picture. Tony, I'm like you, I read the bio. And I mean, as I'm reading it, no, if you can't spell, if you're like, come on now, this is your first impression. But I do encourage people. Yeah, I do encourage people to have the list. Now, let me say this, y'all, and I'm talking, I think, primarily to the ladies, okay? For those of y'all that got the 72-page list, now look,
Right.
years ago, I had this list. It was like 3 pages long, y'all. It was long. And I feel like Jesus was like, April, like, I'm not, like, come on, that's not even, I can't even meet like that list. So I think that, yeah, when we're preparing for that relationship is, really looking at things like, do our core values align? Our, characteristics, can I trust this person? One of the things that's on my list is that he has a good support system, right? So that could be friends, pastor, whatever that may look like, but that he has a support system, because I just do not believe that one person should be everything for another person. I don't think that God created us that way. And I think
Yeah.
that's a lot of pressure to put on a partner. Other things, like we said, we talked about the physical, right? Like God gave us eyes and, I want something nice to look at. But when it
Right.
comes to physical, right, my big thing is, what is your health like?
Mm,
Right? Do you take care of
yeah.
it? I stay active. I'm not a gym rat, but I like to hike. I like to spin. I like to stay active. So, like, what is your health like? Right.
Yeah.
So, really taking the time to understand what it is that we want.
Yeah.
So,
Definitely.
I've got this question,
I know. Uh-oh. So we
and
brace
I'm gonna
ourselves.
start with Tony. When did you know that Dr. Lisa was the one?
Well, I can remember this. I can remember this real vividly. We had gone out, on date night. We obviously had a wonderful time. So I don't know if most men will even discuss this, but I'm racing home simply so I can revisit every stage of the evening that I just shared with Lisa. So as I scurry through my house, groom yourself, etc., dive into my bed, then I start leafing through my mind all those sequence of events that we had just shared with one another from, I don't know, 10, 11, 12 o'clock to 2, 3 o'clock in the morning. So I start thinking like, wow, this is amazing. You can't even go to sleep. You lost track of time. And it's all focused around this lady named Lisa. So I said, I think she's the one. I might as well accept it, digest it, and keep it moving. So that was and I've told her about that evening. So that was my moment when I knew, I said, wow, this is the one. I can't sleep. I'm waking up. I'm rushing tomorrow and all that stuff.
How
Yeah.
about
So
you,
that was,
Dr. Lisa?
Yeah, I think for me it was definitely one of our date nights. And it was a date where, so Tony usually always was, treating me, taking me out and whatever. So this particular date, I said, you know what? I'm taking you out.
yeah, I remember
So I took him out on a date. You remember that? To a jazz club. And we ended up having this very intimate area of the club, which I didn't
Yes.
really even know we were going to be sitting there. But it was like upstairs. We were kind of by ourselves. And I remember the atmosphere was just so very romantic, and I had ordered a bottle of wine for us and everything, which he was like looking at me like, what, look at her. So I ordered a bottle of wine, and as we were sort of just enjoying the meal, he was just very romantic that evening. Like, he poured my glass of wine, and then he was feeding me some of the food that we had. We were holding hands under the
Under the
table,
table.
and I was like, oh
Okay.
my God, I feel like I'm 15. But the sparks were just kind of
Yeah.
going, I think, at that moment. And I felt like this was an intimate moment that I had not experienced in God knows how long, like a very,
Right.
very long time. And I felt like, oh, I think he could be the one. I think he could be the one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I love it. I love it. I love it. I love it. So, you guys now have decided to do this podcast together. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so I think as we were sort of just talking and just reflecting on our journey and sort of where we were, where we, eventually got to in terms of remarrying again, we felt like there were a lot of people who could resonate with our story, or we could actually
Yeah.
be an inspiration to those who may have gone through a divorce, right? Or, for some people maybe who even find themselves, widowed and looking for love again, and
Yes.
just giving them the hope and the belief that love is possible, and helping them along their healing journey. as well as being able to provide them hopefully with some insight and some steps into how, they could find that person again, if that's what they choose to
Yeah.
do, right? So out of that, I talked to Tony and I said, what do you think about us doing a podcast? And, for me, I can't say it was natural, but I've done podcasts in the past, so I kind of was familiar with the format, but I knew also what kind of a reach a podcast could have,
Mm.
right? And how many people we would be able to sort of, touch. So when I came to Tony with the idea, he immediately said yes. That's sort of just how the podcast was born.
Yeah.
Love it. I love how, and I just feel like God orchestrates certain relationships. And thinking back, like, you guys probably would have never thought to do a podcast about relationships without meeting each other, right? And I do think that when you meet, whether you call it the purpose partner or the one, or, that person that God has for you, it just unlocks all these other opportunities if we're obedient, right? To share our story,
Yeah.
to help others. Because I do believe that for a lot of us, the journey that we go through is not meant just for us, right? It is meant so that we can pour into others, which is literally why I do the work that I do, is pouring into other people. So tell us where we can listen to the podcast, how often it comes out.
Yeah.
On all social media platforms, iHeartRadio, YouTube. We actually have our own website, sayingyesagain.com, right?
You can listen to it on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeart, so all the podcast platforms, it's available there. And then, like Tony mentioned, we also have a YouTube channel. So if you want to see us live in terms of video format, it's there.
Interacting.
Yes. And we do our weekly show. So weekly, every Tuesday we drop a new episode. So definitely you can check us out there.
Awesome. Well, I just want to thank you guys again for being on the show, for sharing your story, for your vulnerability, and for doing the work that you're doing. Thank you.
Yes,
Thank you.
absolutely.
Thank
And thank
you
you for
very much for
having
having
us. This
us.
is a wonderful conversation.
Yes. Thank you.
Awesome. Well, all right, y'all. Thank you again for listening to this episode. Once again, my only ask is that if you enjoyed this, send it to somebody. You never know who just needs to hear a wonderful story of healing and love, especially from just a great couple like Dr. Lisa and Tony. And so you guys get out there, listen to the episodes. I want you guys to go back. If you haven't heard season 1 or 2, jump back into season 1 and 2. I guarantee you will hear something that will encourage you so that you and I are ready when love comes.